Helen, infant feeding.
Thank you. Thank you. It's my party. I can talk if I want to. Just for a change today, I'm going to talk about baby food. Most people are used to me talking about infant formula, but I'm going to talk about our new report, which is actually launched today, which you've all got a copy of. A little bit longer in gestation than we planned, because we actually did the first database of all the products that we look at in this a couple of years ago, but we didn't quite write the report in time, and when we went back to look, lots of them had changed, so we had to sort of redo it. So it's taken a little bit longer than we thought, but I'm going to talk about some of the key issues with this, and it really does totally, to me, dovetail into all our work on infant feeding and how we do that transition across from milk to food and how we think about that. So I think the big question really is, what are these commercial baby foods for? And I think we've become so used to the idea that they exist, that they're on the shelves. And in fact, the more you go shopping as you do all the work that I do around infant formula and baby foods, the more you sort of spot people's behaviour. And I was in a giant Sainsbury's the other day buying some products, which you're going to be looking at in a minute. And just watching parents going down the aisle with their baskets, just filling them with these foods that seem to be talking to them as these are things for your baby. And that sort of ubiquitous nature of foods actually does change behaviour. Charlotte did a great talk this morning about what we know about infant feeding. Obviously, the WHO global strategy that came out in 2003 is kind of our umbrella still for a lot of the work we do in all countries of the world. We must never forget that in developing countries, we are very similar in developed world too. So it's not just one rule for them. We should be thinking about all these things. And when you look at what they talk about in terms of what complementary feeding should be, so what we should be doing from about 6 months alongside breast milk in the first year of life, they talk about some really key things. So it needs to be timely, and that is about this increased need for energy and nutrients exceeding what can be provided through exclusive breastfeeding as the baby goes into its growth spurts in later life. So we need to think about the comparison of composition. It's about adequacy, making sure that they provide sufficient energy, protein and micronutrients as that child grows. Obviously, safety is hugely important, and we're very lucky, as Charlotte said, we live in a world here with a very safe food supply. And then they use this word sort of properly fed, which is about following the infant's cues, realistically, about that feeding journey. So their appetite and satiety, understanding their own energy needs, understanding that these are going to change day to day for infants and young children, that all of those things are part and parcel of that feeding experience. And in the WHO report, they talk about using fingers, spoons, and self-feeding, this combination of things that you need to do to get that child on its eating journey. And then they also talk about culturally specific, low-cost, complementary foods prepared with locally available ingredients. And I think that's the bit which we've forgotten about entirely in countries like this. We want to get those young children onto the foods, the healthy family foods that we'd like them to continue. These two photos, the top one you'll have seen from some of our resources. This is Thomas. He was the son of one of the research associates at City University, and he was exclusively breastfed for 6 months. And when it was his 6-month birthday, I asked Donna, his mum, if she'd bring him round, because I wanted to take pictures of a baby turning their head away when you offered them solids. But no. Everything we tried him with, he just absolutely loved, whether it was broccoli or watermelon or egg or fish or anything. But I had some lovely pictures of him enjoying his first food. The one at the bottom isn't my niece in Japan. I did have a brilliant photo of her, but I couldn't find it. But my niece and nephew have been brought up in Tokyo. And the thing that really struck me when I went to visit them when they were babies is that from about 6 months when they're having solids, they are introduced to the sorts of foods that some of us might find a little challenging. Slightly mouldy beans, very bitter green vegetables, very oily fish, even with heads on. And all the parents and grandparents stand around like, giving this child this sense that this is amazing food for them to enjoy. And yet here we seem to have shifted towards a culture where we think baby food somehow has to be a bit bland, a bit sweet and a bit mushy, away from all the things that we know work around the world. And there is, of course, obviously lots of issues around developmental readiness, and this has been very well reviewed in the literature. Not just nutritional readiness, but a baby's readiness for solids and all of its physiological processes. And when you look at all that literature, you suddenly have to think to yourself, how on earth did we end up recommending this idea of super smooth purees for infants, never mind under 6 months of age, but since then? I would urge you all to read this book by Amy Bentley. She's a professor at New York University, and she's written a fantastic review of the history of baby food. And when I read this, there are so many parallels to the infant formula story about how marketing can totally change people's behaviour. And so this is obviously a review of the American food system, but there are so many similarities for us. There are very good reasons why you might want to mush food up and market it and sell it in small portions. Huge cost advantage to using up fruits and vegetables in particular that might be unsightly, unshapely, knobbly. No one sees what they look like when they're crushed up. So a lot of companies discovered this was a fantastic way to use up some of that produce. So whether it's leftovers, too much of stuff, and finding a way of marketing it at great price, this became a way for people to change behaviour. And it's a really fantastic review she does of how that all happened. And very much in the same way that many health professionals were targeted around infant formula, they were very heavily targeted around baby food. Now, these are both Gerber adverts, and the Gerber story in itself is incredibly interesting. Gerber is now owned by Nestle, and the whole story about the Gerber baby and the influence that had on family patterns is also a really interesting story. But they directly targeted paediatricians and family members and dietitians and health workers to really try and persuade them that babies were better off being weaned earlier than they ever had been on soft and smooth purees, and that commercial baby food was safer and healthier for babies. And they did many of the same things the formula industry do, which is slightly not be open and honest about the evidence base, slightly changing the things that they produce. And when you look back at all of that evidence, you suddenly realise just how important it is that all of us really reflect on just what marketing can do to people's behaviour. So our new report is looking very specifically at a particular group of baby foods. We haven't done all of it. I'm also highlighting Amy Brown's new book. This isn't out yet, it's going to be out later this year. Amy, unfortunately, couldn't come today. But Amy is a psychologist, as many of you will know. Her book, Breastfeeding Uncovered, Pinter and Martin are here today. If you haven't seen it, really good read. And Amy's book is going to look very much at some of the story about why we changed infant feeding patterns and how we need to change them back. So it's a good complement to the work that we've done. So what we did in our report is we looked at jars and pouches in the first year of life, so those are ones marketed for infants up to a year. There are 4 big brands that dominate the market here in the UK: Cow & Gate, Ella's Kitchen, Heinz and Hip Organic. But of course, this is a market that is very popular for new startups and mumpreneurs and all sorts of people who can see this as an opportunity. When you look at all of the smaller niche company websites, they're all quite similar. They all tell you a story about how we had our first baby and there was nothing we wanted to feed them, so we had to invent our own. Or they'll find a niche in some way. I love this Babby's one, which says every ingredient used for a reason. Like, why else would it be there? But I think some of these survive, some of them don't, but it's a very popular market. But what I would say is that if you look at the niche products, the more expensive ones, most of them follow a very similar pattern. And what often happens when people enter the market, interestingly, is they really start off with good intentions. They actually think, I'm going to change the market, but actually they can't sell their products because the population is still very locked into a certain type of baby food. So they just adapt their products to match, and I'll talk about one of those a bit later. So we looked at about 343 products, and I say we, so this was me and Susan Westland, who's over in the First Step stand today. And these are the ones that were on the market last year. We try not to pick on any one of them in particular. They are all examples, and they are all examples you'll find in other brands as well. We did also ask the companies to answer quite a lot of questions about their foods, and we've given some of their responses in the report. And we couldn't quite decide what to do with the information, but we ended up with about 16 key issues which we thought were quite important. I'm not going to talk about all of these today, but they're all in the report as separate sections. Things that we think are quite worrying in terms of the types of foods that are being marketed to families in the UK. Because it's first steps, obviously nothing would be done without some practical element to it. So we have our evidence base at the beginning, and then at the back of the report, we've actually tried to do some comparisons of purchased commercial baby food versus homemade. We haven't made up their version of baby food because actually many of the sorts of foods they make up have very little of the main ingredient in them. So we've made up versions that we think would reflect what somebody would do. So for example, with this one, if I was making something up called broccoli, pears and peas, I'd probably put broccoli in first and then some pears and peas, as opposed to what the companies do. So if you look at all our examples, they're not like for like, they're what we think is the most likely alternative. And we look at the comparison in cost. Obviously, our costs were based on buying things that you would buy domestically, and when we bought organic produce, we did cost that up mostly using Dutchy originals from Waitrose or Waitrose, so our costs are much higher than obviously they would be for any company. And Cheryl Adams is here today, and when I talked to Cheryl about this at the IHV, she said it's all very well to talk about baby food, but you've also got to say what would health professionals say about it. So at the back of the report, we've also put in some Q&As and some advice of things you might want to talk about with families around baby food. So I'm just going to pick out a few key issues. And I suppose the first one we always have to talk about is the fact that nearly half of all the foods being marketed are being marketed for infants under 6 months of age. Now, obviously, that is legal within the EU. You are legally allowed to market baby food from 4 months of age. But we are seeing increasing good practice. So Asda only market from 6 months, as do Marks and Spencer's. Organics are only marketing from 6 months from this year. And quite a lot of the smaller brands are only doing from 6 months. And I think we are going to see a shift. The European Food Safety Authority, EFSA, are reviewing currently the baby food regulations, and they're going to be reporting in 2018. And what we'd really like to see is some policy coherence across regulation so that our trade regulation matches our health regulations. And so that we would really hope that we will see this shift so that it's not confusing for families and health professionals to say exclusive breastfeeding for 6 months, but then they go to shopping and they're surrounded by products. And of course, if you are unfortunate enough to be signed up to any of the formula company helplines or email alert lists, they will start telling you about foods for your baby from when your baby's about 9 and 10 weeks old. I'm signed up for all of them. I have so many fictional children, you have no idea. And, you know, it is quite shocking how you just think, goodness, you know, by the time my baby was 9 weeks old, I was only just getting it together with breastfeeding. Suddenly they're telling you about the need for solids. And so those things all tie up together. Most of the first foods that are being marketed have 3 main criteria. They're sweet, they're soft, and they're low in nutrient density. And despite what they're called, most of them are cheap, easily pureed apple and pear. And that's the reality of what most of them are. So I'm not going to pick on anyone. I'm going to try and show examples, but this is Ella's Kitchen products. Ella's Kitchen do name most of the main ingredients in their names, but I'll just pick out a couple here. If you look at broccoli, pears and peas, it's 79% pears. If you look at red peppers, sweet potatoes and apples, 78% apples. So they are all primarily apple puree with something else. And there's a really big question about whether or not there is any point in mixing those vegetable tastes in with the sweet taste to encourage the liking of vegetables. And I think most of our evidence, we did review the evidence, and I absolutely understand what Charlotte's saying about the observational nature of it, but we've tried to review the evidence that we do have, certainly says there is no evidence to suggest that adding sweetness to vegetables is of any way helpful to getting babies to understand different tastes. When we asked the companies why they name them like this, they said they name them by the main taste in the product. But I have to say, I've tried quite a lot of these, often with a blindfold on, and it's almost impossible and indiscernible to know what any of them are because they mostly taste the same. So I think that's quite an interesting one. If you look at Heinz, theirs is even more bizarre in that they don't actually name apple puree in the names of their products. They actually call it fruit 100% and then tell you that it's mostly apple puree. So if you're looking, someone's going out there buying strawberry, raspberry and banana, they're actually getting 80% apple. And there's a really good question there about how honest that is, I would say, in terms of the sorts of things people are buying. And people aren't going to read these little tiny labels. They are quite small. If you take one of the more premium brands, and I'm picking on Piccolo here, partly because they do have this relationship with the NCT, and I do hope the NCT are going to review that. Now, Piccolo gives some of their profits to the NCT, but I think it looks a little bit like endorsement. They started off with a small range, it's expanded very rapidly, but Spring Greens, that has 5% spring greens in it, is not spring greens. It's actually apple and pear puree, and it's almost impossible to taste anything that tastes like greens. In general, bitter vegetables are very rarely used in baby food in general. And when they do these single-taste vegetable packs, and Ella's Kitchen have been doing a big promotion on Veg for Victory and promoting work in a paper they did with the British Nutrition Foundation, talking about how they're going to be our partners in terms of introducing vegetable tastes, they only produce sweet-taste vegetables. They don't produce any bitter-tasting vegetables. And that actually undermines the theory behind the project. Interestingly, in the US, and I'm always fascinated by the difference, as you'll all know, we have quite good regulation, but we're not very good at doing anything about it when people break it. In America, they have no regulation, and every now and again, they sue the pants off people. So Centre for Science in the Public Interest, which is an NGO based in Washington, actually a couple of years ago threatened with lawsuits Plum Organics and Gerber, and they call it bait and switch, meaning you're bringing people in, but then they're getting a different product than they're expecting. We don't have a name for it here. And they notified companies who are going to be sued, and they highlighted quite a lot of products. They don't have to put any percentage of ingredients at all on the labels there, so it's almost impossible to know what it is. But this one, which is quinoa, leeks, and chicken, you have to get a long way down before you get to quinoa, which suggests very little in terms of composition. And that was quite successful. So actually, after they threatened to sue them, the companies did say they were going to change the naming conventions and name it in order. And Plum Organics actually said they're going to name their baby pouches in order of predominance and make sure that imagery on the product labels reflects the predominance of the ingredients. And I've just put Ella's Kitchen, the purple one, and I'm going to come back to that a bit later. And on the pictures, we've got blueberries and blackcurrants. There's not much of those in it. So it's also about the labelling and the visuals. That was something we started to look at in our report, but we're going to come back to that at another time. But I think that's also very important in terms of what people are buying when they're looking at these things. So this one, on the left-hand side, you probably can't see it, but I've circled, this is a USDA, this is the American version. So that's now called pears, peas, and broccoli, and it's from 6 months. But in the UK, we have broccoli, pears, and peas from 4 months, which also is a slight strange thing that you react when you're threatened to be sued in one country, but you don't think it matters elsewhere. I don't quite know how that one works. I'm sure it's about what marketing has told them. So you could argue potentially that maybe we should perhaps be a bit heavy-handed and sometimes sue, but lack of regulation, unfortunately, can lead to some pretty horrible things. So if you're a parent in America, you also are struggling with a whole load of health claims being made on baby food. So this is a range of Plum baby foods, which is basically apple and pear puree, but they throw in a few ground up chia seeds or a few bits of lentil puree or whatever it is, and then actually make health claims about it. And we are incredibly keen that we avoid health claims on baby food here in the UK and in the EU. And we will fight very hard for that, because health claims totally undermine people's ability to make good choices around food. And there's no place on baby food for health claims, when actually you're much better off with real food. And I think we have to really fight that one very hard. So I think we're better off with regulation. Perhaps the odd bit of suing would be nice. One of the other things that I was really struck by when you look at all the baby foods is just how low the meat and fish content is. And Charlotte's is right in that in this country people are a bit slow to introduce meat and fish to babies, but actually there's no reason at all why we don't introduce those foods from about 6 months of age. Most of the brands of baby food just meet the minimum legal requirements, and they're very low. And there's also a naming convention in the EU regulations, which means that if you call it chicken stew, it has to have 10% chicken in it, but if you call it yummy chicken stew, it only has to have 8% chicken in it. I joke not. And so obviously when you start looking at all the names, you look at them in a whole new light. But obviously that very, very low content of the meat does mean they tend to be low in iron and zinc, even if sometimes they're a bit fortified. In general, baby foods in surveys come out as being quite low. And in fact, obviously everyone will know that you can't add iron to organic baby food, so therefore those foods are not fortified. So they have very low content of some of the main ingredients. They also have a very high content of water, or Ella's Kitchen call it stock, but we have said it's water. And I think people will be quite shocked at just how much water is in some of these baby foods. So we're talking, 40 to 50% of the content being water. Now, obviously, pouches have to have kind of a softer texture to get through that little tiny nozzle, so therefore the water content tends to be a bit higher. So you do have to question what it is you're buying and what impact that then has on the volume of food a baby has to eat to get the amount of energy and nutrients they need, but also the value for money of all of that, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And one of the things we looked at was energy density, and obviously the energy density of breast milk is about 0.69, and we were looking again at this WHO concept that actually the foods being offered should, for the most part, add additional energy and nutrients to the breastfed baby. And as you can see, there's a hugely large variation across products in their energy density. So as a group, commercial baby foods are actually quite erratic in what they try and offer. And there's no way when you go shopping that you will know if you're buying a more or less energy and nutrient dense food. They don't do it in that way. They don't have any standards that they're based on. In our Eating Well the first year, in order to calculate the sorts of foods and amounts of foods that we thought would meet the energy and nutrient needs of babies, we did have to come up with some kind of background information. We know all babies are different and we know it's developmental, but you have to sometimes have some structure to put your work around. And actually a 7 to 9 month old baby only needs about 85 calories at 3 meals a day alongside breast milk. And a 10 to 12 month baby, around 100 calories at meals, and you might have a couple of desserts or fruits or something that add a bit more. So they're not huge amounts of energy that babies need as they develop. Very, very important that they have those that are nutrient dense. So we're not giving them lots of energy, but without the nutrients that go with it. And when you start to compare the commercial baby foods, they just don't look great in terms of what we're trying to do. So this is a little comparison of something, sorry, I seem to be using a lot of Ella's Kitchen, I can't think why. So they produce something called cauliflower cheese and butter beans, which is obviously half water, has a little bit of cauliflower and butter beans. So, and we just thought, well, if we were making cauliflower cheese and butter beans, we'd actually use quite a lot of cauliflower and quite a lot of butter beans. And you can see the sheer difference in energy density by using those ingredients as you would make them at home compared to paying for it in a pouch. And I think it's quite shocking. And that's quite a large volume for a young baby to manage. And if they don't manage all of it, they're going to be missing out on important energy and nutrients within that volume of food that they have. The one thing it's really important to know about First Steps is that we eat everything we make. So even when we do the baby food report, we all sit round afterwards and we eat it, because my theory is if it's not good enough for us, it's not good enough for babies. This one was really nice, the cauliflower cheese and butter beans. Top tip, I'd make that. So one of the things the companies told us is we said, what do you base your baby foods on? And they all said, oh, they're nutritionally balanced, or they have some kind of criteria, but we don't quite know what they are. But I would say that it's just very random. And actually, as the companies are all moving from jars to pouches, they're just changing their volumes without any kind of idea of the difference between the volume and the content. And you can see here that the range of energy in foods is really quite variable. So you could be buying some kind of meal or pouch, it could be anything between 95 and 207 calories, for example. So you don't know when you're feeding your baby that these are quite variable products and what impact that might have. And although the energy density is low, most of them have more energy in than a baby needs because the volumes are quite big. And there is a limit to how small they can make packaging to make it make sense. So sugar, everyone's talking about sugar in the world of nutrition, so I thought I'd join in. Obviously, if you are ultra-processing fruits and vegetables, then those sugars are going to be liberated from the cells. If you're macerating them, heat-treating them, and storing them, they're likely to be quite high in sugars. And we do think those are now free sugars. And therefore, processed baby foods are likely to have a high free sugar content. And this is going to be a really interesting argument for us as to whether we really start saying these are not foods that you should give, ultra-processed foods. There isn't a huge amount of UK data based on the analysis of baby food pouches and jars for sugar, comparing what's on the label with what's found. So this is some American data, but I think it's useful to show, and we put it in the report, but I appreciate that it's not a large body of data. There is one other study that shows the same. But what their thesis is that actually the labelling is often based on what you would find in food tables around a product that's made of fruit and vegetables, but actually by the processing that they undergo, they actually have an awful lot more sugar in them by the time they're processed. And you can see all of them had more sugar in than on the label, and some in very much greater amounts. And I think that's something we really need to look at as a scientific community, some of this new data. So then people say to me, well, how different is it if you mash your own? I think there's an enormous difference if you mash your own or if you buy it in a packet. And again, I'll come on to that again in a minute about the taste. It's pretty obvious. But if you're mashing your own food, you are not going to liberate all the sugars from the cells. You're likely to consume it relatively soon after you've made it. It's not going to be ultra-heat treated. And you're going to have a bit more fibre in that as you eat it. And I think we have to be really clear about the distinction between something that's ultra-processed and something that's homemade. And one of the concepts that we use quite a lot, if you've seen our posters that we've done on eating well, is this idea that you're going for minimally processed food and avoiding ultra-processed food for babies and young children. Amazingly, some baby foods still have sugar added to them, and some foods are still using sugar as an ingredient, and there's absolutely no need for that whatsoever. Babies don't need to have foods with sugar in. And actually, again, one of the great things about making things is realising how great things can taste without sugar. So when I made my Heinz chocolate pudding for the book with cocoa and custard, actually it tasted really nice because you could really taste that chocolatey taste that you can't taste when things have sugar in. And I was quite amazed because I thought I'd hate it. So we really should be saying there should be no sugars added to these foods now. There has been some work done in the UK on processing and what happens. So there's a team at Greenwich University led by Nazanin Zand, and she's done quite a lot of different studies about micronutrient contents. And unsurprisingly, if you put things in jars and pouches and ultra-heat treat it, you are likely to degrade some nutrients. And they found very negligible amounts of some nutrients like riboflavin and vitamin B6 to the point where they were almost undetectable in most baby foods. Now, obviously, they don't have to show that there's any of that nutrient in it, so you don't know when you go and buy a product that it may have none of the nutrients that might be in the foods originally still there. We did ask all the companies if they would share with us their micronutrient analysis data. Most of them said no, one said yes, but they still didn't share. I ask the companies for quite a lot of information all the time. I'm quite used to the non-sharing. But I do think we, again, need to be really looking at these foods because Nazanin's group have actually come up with a paper where they actually are quite concerned that babies fed on purely formula and commercial food may not actually get all the nutrients they need in some of their modelling, and they're looking at that again. So we might be making an assumption that these foods are actually going to adequately nourish babies without the evidence. So there's lots of other key points in the report, but lots of things you'll all be thinking about as health professionals and others in this world. Obviously, the whole issue about texture and progression of texture. Most of these foods are very soft or just have soft lumps. Very hard to distinguish what's in them. These little spoons are all spaghetti bolognese, but they all look exactly the same, whichever brand they are. And the whole thing about pouches. Now, globally, there's some really interesting reports being written about pouches because they are taking the world by storm in a very unhealthy way because they are a hugely convenient way to serve baby food. And I'm going to come back to pouches in a minute, but it does mean soft textures. Sorry. And obviously cost. I mean, one of the things we really focus on quite a lot is about cost and the inequalities around infant feeding. You'll know from our work on infant formula just how enormous the difference can be for a family choosing to use one type of formula compared to another. And they all have to be the same by law. So you're paying for that marketing and branding quite a considerable amount of money. If you look at the different range of products, you'll see per 100 grams, there's quite a different range of prices from products that are all relatively similar. Now, you might think you'd like to pay more for organic versus non-organic. We do discuss that a little bit in the report. But there's still quite large variations. This is a little comparison of all the spaghetti bologneses on the market for 7 months plus. And you can see that jars are an awful lot cheaper than pouches because pouches have a lot less in them, but it's pretty much the same stuff. So you can see why there's this global shift to pouches because the profit margin is so much higher for those products compared to others. So we had a little play, and Susan did this for me. We were looking at different models of, what if you had your baby on Aptamil Pro Futura, the most expensive formula on the market. we don't move our babies on to follow-on. We just stick with first formula. And they're having a brekkie pouch and 2 other pouches from the most expensive range. That's £6.80 a day, £204 a month potentially on a baby. That is a phenomenal amount of money. Now, I'm not suggesting that people do feed their babies entirely in that way, but I think it's worth reflecting on just what a high cost they are. If you went for the cheaper options, so you went for cow and gate first milk, a porridge and 2 jars, even then it's £2.69 a day, which is £81 a month. And I don't know if you know much about family food budgets, but this is the latest data that's come out from the ONS. And in the ONS family spending data, they kind of stratify families into different types. So I've just chosen 2. So they're hard-pressed families, families in rented accommodation group, spend about £53 a week on food and non-alcoholic beverages. Better off families actually spend about £68.40 a week. And actually you could see that if you were buying formula and baby food for your baby, just what an enormous impact that could have on a family food budget. So therefore, families should be really well informed as to what it is they're getting for that enormous outlay of funding. And as we often know, families really want to do the absolute best for their baby. And I've heard health visitors say to me that Ella's Kitchen is very aspirational, that they feel that is something they should work towards for their baby. And they may choose to spend funds on that, and maybe other children in the family or other family members may miss out on healthier food. We often hear people say they can't afford to buy fruits and vegetables. Buy an awful lot of fruits and vegetables for not much baby food. So it's really important that as a group, we all know what to talk about and what to say when we're thinking about commercial baby food. Even if you're just having 1 pouch a day, that's still £42 a month, or £54 a month if you're for an older baby. The other really amazing thing is the food gets more expensive as babies get older, even if it's pretty similar, because they think people expect to pay more. So it's expectation. So in my personal opinion, I think processed baby foods are incredibly expensive for what you get, and they represent poor nutritional value for money. Now, there may be occasions when they are useful, but I think we should be really clear that they are not food for every day for families. And my thesis is that babies shouldn't really cost that much for food. I'm not going to go into the breastfeeding versus formula argument, but in terms of food, when you are introducing family foods to your baby, they should not be an addition, they should be part of that meal, and there shouldn't be a giant cost associated with that. And I think we really need to go back to that idea. And as we always say, the 3 golden rules for feeding babies: minimally processed food, avoid ultra-processed food, and eat as a family. Those really key things to ensuring people can eat well. So these are the kind of key messages that I've got about baby foods at the moment. I think they undermine the messages we're all giving. It's very difficult if you're talking to families using the guidance that we've got, and then what's being sold completely undermines that. I think they can be a significant burden on family food budgets. I've had quite a lot of queries recently from people saying that their local food bank thinks they should stock baby food because families are asking for it. And I think that's a really interesting piece of work we need to really look at and say, actually, how can we support families better? I think, I would disencourage any food bank from giving away baby food purely on safety grounds, if nothing else. There's a whole issue about the change and understanding of babies around food and that progression. And I really want to say baby food companies are not our partners. If they also produce breast milk substitutes or sell food under 6 months of age, those are breast milk substitutes, and therefore the code completely applies to those as well. If you look in your code booklet, you'll see the work that I was part of for the WHO on 69.9, where we were really trying to ensure that food is included in our code work. And we don't want the idea that mushed up pouches of food can be part and parcel of our health promotional education.